In today's episode, we'll be recovering data from the SanDisk Extreme portable device that was previously worked on by the company that sent me this unit. Looking at how squished the balls were underneath the chip, I decided to remove the memory and inspect the board itself. It was clear to me that some kind of work was done with the NAND at least. There was also flux residue around the controller, but we'll get into that later. When the NAND is removed from the board should automatically, by default, go into a ROM mode. ROM mode, safe mode, whatever you want to call it. But that's something that we should be able to ID the device by. And if we get response in that manner, then it's safe to assume that the function of the controller is there. Now, removing the memory chip like this does require some hot air. In some cases, sometimes I do use a bottom preheater, but I noticed that cranking up the heat a little bit more, working currently at 400 degrees Celsius, makes it fairly easy to remove those chips, and it doesn't really affect their functionality whatsoever. So let's remove this memory, inspect the board and the pads. Maybe there's some work underneath there that we'll need to do, but mainly I want to make sure that the controller still responds. It is clear that a lot of protective mask had been scraped previously, because you can see a lot of pads merge, and the solder that's supposed to be forming half a sphere is spread into more of a oval shape, merging bigger area than a round pad that was initially designated. Cleaning it up with some wick will help us see the exact damage to those trace protective coatings, and most likely that stuff will have to be redone later with the protective mask. I gotta say that this is probably the most damage to the protective coating that I have seen on these devices to this day, so there's going to be a lot of mask work after. Now it's time to plug in the SSD without the NAND to confirm that the SanDisk controller is working. So let's power it on PC3000, enter Universal Utility, and see what we get as a passport. The devices recognize the SanDisk Polaris, and that's all I needed to know. I assume that the controller is functional, and we can move on to the next step, which is mask repair. This mask repair is a necessary step. Without it, the chip will never mount correctly. It doesn't matter how good we reball it. The exposed pad, when it's not, when it has a big area that had been scraped up, will soak in the solder from the chip, and it will not be distributed in proportionate amounts. So some pads will be too low, some pads will be too high, and what that will create is bad contact somewhere. It will take, for some specific signals, it will take one bad connection for this whole thing not to work. So clearly enough, we need to separate all of these scraped up pads, make sure that the area that is exposed is as close to the original as possible, and only then cure it and remount the chip after the reballing is done. I have to say that this was probably the most amount of mask work that I ever had to do on a single device. So if you do this, you just gotta make sure you're super careful with how you remove the leftover solder from devices like that. As you saw me do that at the beginning, do not use soldering iron and scrape away. Basically use a tweezer and hot air over the top to remove excess solder when the chip is pulled. So now we're ready to cure this thing up with some UV light. And I think I missed one spot, so I'm just gonna add an extra drop there and cure it once again, and we can start working on our chip. The chip needs to be reballed. In order for it to mount perfectly, all of the pads underneath it need to be uniform and exactly the same. For that I use a stencil and solder paste, but first let's clean all of that old solder off of it and make sure that the chip is completely flat. Before using wick, I like to use my Kester solder mix to clean up pads. Maybe the solder that's on there right now is good enough, but just to be safe, it only takes a few seconds. So I use the roll and a hot iron, just kind of fill up all of the pads with new stuff, and then soak it all up with the wick. To reball the chip, the paste I use is made by PPG. It's 183 degrees melting point and a stencil. I don't have specific stencil for this type of chip, but the stencil I'm using has extra pads that will form extra spare solder balls that we'll later have to pick up. Just gotta be careful not to let them skip their positions and add more solder into neighboring ones. It happened to me a few times, but this paste has been really good for me lately. It's staying more on the dry side, so it doesn't leak out and transfer to the neighboring members. And just jam it up with some bent tweezers. Hot temperature is set to 275 degrees, and I use like 50 air on this. The chip is thick, so it takes a little longer for that stuff to melt. You just kind of need to move the tweezers down the chip slightly to apply even amount of pressure to the chip, and once it's all melted, we can release. I get asked this all the time. What is that clear stuff that you add before the chip begins to flow? Basically, that stuff is called flux, and it helps solder flow better. It's you must use something like this for a project like that. And the board actually has these corners marked out on it to help us with positioning. Also, by the U2 we have a tiny dot on the board that indicates first pin for the chip, and the chip has a dot on it also indicating the orientation of that first pin. So we just line them up set our temperature, and heat the device up. This is a low melt solder, so the chip will begin to flow much easier. But again, this is a really big board. There's tons of ground planes on it, and the board itself will be soaking in a lot of heat, so we may have to go at it for a little bit. But currently I'm running at 400 degrees, and that temperature has been working great for me. To confirm that our solder balls are melted, we need to apply a little bit of pressure to the chip, and it should spring right back with tension. I'm really happy with how this reball went and how the chip is now mounted. So let's just confirm that we don't have any shorts on our NAND by checking these capacitors, and if we don't get a constant beeping on them, we're good to go. Let's power on the device and wait for the lights and the registries to come up. Refresh the passport and we see our proper ID. I went ahead and started the imaging task because I don't know whether this is gonna be long-lasting solution or just something temporary. So it's best to start the task right away and clone the device. Usually, if the unit is not full, I'll be going by use space map, and in our case, this device only shows 381 gigabytes of data. If you found yourself in a similar situation where your SanDisk Extreme Portable SSD stopped working, link in the description or the card in the top right corner that appears on the screen right now will take you to our website where you can request a service. If you like this presentation, let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit like. That helps our videos to go up in the algorithm and get higher ranking, get more exposure. I really do appreciate it. And thank you guys for spending time watching this episode, and I'll see you all in the next one.